Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the penultimate event in the Leveling the Playing Field speaker series, which, as you will have seen from the holding slide, and many of you being on these speaker series before, is a collaboration between us at the Diversity Project, the Social Mobility Foundation, and also Progress Together. My name's David Audula. By day, I'm a portfolio manager, and by night, or other parts of the day, I'm one of the co-leads of the Diversity Project's social mobility community. And today's event is really focused on some practical aspects of how you can embed diversity, but particularly socioeconomic diversity and social mobility, into your firm's strategy. The aim is really to give you some actionable insights and takeaways that you can take with you to your firms tomorrow, which of course is Social Mobility Day. As you can see from the agenda slide, we've split this event into two sessions. I'm really excited about both. You can see the first one is a fireside chat with Duncan Exley. He is the author of The End of Aspiration, Social Mobility, and Our Children's Fading Prospects. And he'll be in conversation with one of the other co-leads of the social mobility community here at the Diversity Project, James Whiteman. And then I'll host a panel on some of the real practical aspects of what we can do and what we can learn from other industries. I'll introduce the panelists later, but rest assured there's some fantastic speakers, and all of whom have got a different practical viewpoints on how we can really move the dial tomorrow and hopefully over the coming months and years. So let's get started. I'll pass over to my co-lead James and, of course, Duncan Exley.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for the introduction. Thanks so much, Duncan, for sparing us your time today. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be talking to you today. Well, I think one of the best things about leading the social mobility community and doing the great work that we've tried to do within this area is getting the chance to speak to experts like you and everyone that's going to be on the panel later. It's really great to be able to speak to you and obviously listen to all the insights. I mean, it's a few years now since your book came out, but I'm self-confessed sort of late to the party in terms of reading it, and we connected on LinkedIn a few months ago, and that was the prompt for getting you involved in this session. One of my excuses for kind of only getting round to it in the last few months has been I've been working my way through all the social mobility tomes, and there's a very illustrious kind of group of people in that area. Dr. Louise Ashley, you've got Dr. Sam Friedman, and also Dr. Lee Elliott Major, and some pretty incredible minds. And it's great to have you on this one with us as well. As David mentioned, your book's The End of Aspiration. I noticed at the back of it, it flags that you were director of the Equality Trust. And that kind of linked me back to another book that had a really big impact on me, which was The Spirit Level, which I know that I think it was Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson were the two authors of that. And I just, as a way of kind of introducing yourself and maybe what got you interested in this topic, is there anything about that book that you would want to reflect on? And if not, then just please feel free to just dive straight in with why you got involved in social mobility and kind of how it means things to you. And
yeah, I think that was really it's what led me there. In a way, there was something dormant, but it's what led me there. Before I worked there, I worked at an organization called Share Action, which basically works on ESG things.
And
we were the conduit between institutional investors and the NGOs on the ground who sort of tend to spot environmental and social issues. So income inequality was already on my radar, and income inequality is what the Spirit Level's all about, and it draws correlations between countries with high levels of various social problems and those with high levels of income inequality. Now, one of the big chapters in the book is about social mobility, and the correlation between countries with high levels of income inequality and those with low levels of social mobility is huge. For those who know about stats, it's about 0.8 or something. It's ridiculous. So, the more unequal places, the less social mobility you're going to get. So I found myself immersed in that discourse about social mobility, and it was huge at the time. You know, every prime minister since Thatcher has said we want to open up opportunities for people from different backgrounds. Academics were talking about it on the back of Joe Blandon, who'd done a massive report about how social mobility in the UK was going down and was lower than most of the developed economies. But I was myself sitting there looking at it as a stereotypical social mobility story, in that my dad worked down a coal mine and my mum was a shop assistant. And I was now chief exec of something. So I was finding that what people were saying in the media, in politics, about what facilitates social mobility and what motivates people to become social or mobile, it didn't reflect my experience at all. So it's why for my book, I gathered together a group of 20 people who'd experienced social mobility in various walks of life and asked them what they did, and was led by that to go and look at the data. And you know, a lot of the time what they were saying might have been mentioned in the academic things, but it wasn't prioritized.
Thanks, Duncan. And I deliberately didn't ask this question first because it's kind of a bit of a boring kind of pragmatic one. But can you just clarify what you mean by social mobility when you talk about it? Because there are definitions, and I know there'll be different in terms of our audience. There'll be different knowledge bases of people who are tuning in. So apologies for some people who are kind of really au fait with this, but it's just worth getting out.
Yeah, I'll try to do it basically because it is a technical definition. So usually when people, especially when politicians talk about it, they are talking about the likelihood that any individual will move up or down the league table of incomes in the country compared to where their parents were at the same age. Occasionally they are talking about whether you move up or down the occupational scale, i.e. you go from a manual profession that your parents had to having a skilled profession or professional occupation or whatever. So it will either be one of those sorts of things, up or down the league table of incomes, or up or down the occupational scale. But I think one of the things that has fascinated me since then is, I think, and talking to people, is that what people seem to talk about in the public when they talk about this isn't those data things. It's basically, are you able to attain the things most of us aspire to? You know, a home to call your own, a job that's rewarding in all senses of the word, the wherewithal, including the financial security to have a relationship and a family. Being able to have those sorts of things, and also that idea that, you know, where you end up in your life shouldn't be determined by your background. It should be more determined by your aspirations and your aptitudes and your efforts.
Thank you. Yeah. And so just to build on that, how would you say your perspective on social mobility has changed over time, and what's your kind of view of where we are in the UK right now?
I think that, you know, I started off looking at those correlations with income, and my understanding's broadened a lot. So it's a lot less coldly economic. And actually what the people I spoke to in my book spoke to me about most, and what I end up talking to the organizations I now work with about most, are the cultural things, quite often knowing the protocols. So one of the interviewees, one of the case studies for my book, who I work with quite a bit, who experienced very long range social mobility in that he's now foreign secretary. He talked about going into law and saying, oh, it's like having two jobs. It's like having, you know, the first one is learning your job as you do on the first day in a job and learning everything, and it's a massive learning curve. But the other one, he said he felt like he was on a crash course in applied anthropology, you know, learning how things work in this new weird upper middle class environment. And that has become a really big thing. And obviously some of those cultural knowledges, if you like, are picked up in ways that cost money and it is economic. But I find this all over the place, and it's why I think it's not just about class, but it is about those mechanisms that, you know, my specialism is in socioeconomic, this social mobility thing. But if you do consultancy on this sort of stuff, you know, you really ought to be able to spot red flags with regard to other demographics. So, you know, I work with people who deal with, for example, ethnicity. And the same thing comes up, that there are protocols and there are practices built around what feels comfortable and what feels common sense and convenient to the dominant demographic in the workplace. But they leave the rest of us on the back foot. You know, so the things aren't designed around people of our socioeconomic background or our ethnic background or our gender or neurotype or whatever. And really, it's not about reaching out to a small section of people from working class backgrounds and making them feel comfortable. In the end, it comes down to making sure things are adapted to the needs of the diverse majority of us and not just the comfort zone of, you know, the people who've always been in those jobs.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, that's given me a good opportunity to plug the recent research that's come out from the Diversity Project in partnership with Professor Alex Edmonds around cognitive diversity. You mentioning the other diversity factors there is kind of hugely important. And we've often talked in our community, in our social mobility community, as part of the Diversity Project, about this concept of the mispricing of talent. And what we've done really with that is tried to lean into the business case for social mobility and to try to kind of point out to our member firms and anyone else kind of on the periphery who's in areas of influence that there's a lot of talent being wasted and being left, you know, on the table because of certain hiring practices and biases and so on. And it's to try and unlock that mindset at the C-suite and middle management to sort of say, well, there's a lot of talent here that's being overlooked. Does that resonate with you? And what do you think might be the implications for recruitment and HR policies kind of around that?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's part of what led me to be doing the sort of work I do now, because I found when I was working in, you know, earlier jobs in my career that I was seeing things that my colleagues from more privileged backgrounds weren't seeing, which wasn't to do with my, you know, I haven't got some superior perceptive skills or something. But I was seeing ways in which we were driving customers away or missing opportunities to appeal to customers. And then there was later a thing that I think this is a really good illustration, that I was once, I was at the Equality Trust. I was planning some joint work with a think tank who I won't name. And I said, look, there's going to be a referendum on our membership of the EU in about 6 months' time. You know, what happens to this planning if there's a leave vote? Yeah, and they looked at me as if I was absolutely stupid and went, well, clearly that's not going to happen. You know, and, you know, I wasn't stupid, but I don't think he was, because, you know, he would have been surrounded, the sort of background he came from, he would have been surrounded by people who were voting Remained. You know, and you know what is closest to you, and you overestimate the normality of it.
Yeah, another one sort of related to that springs to mind is that Lee Clark example of free school meals, I think, and just the level of conversation that was happening in government around that. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but yeah, just triggered, made me think of that.
That's actually the this more, because it's social mobility things this week.
Yeah,
I was at, I think at the law firm Brown Jacobson this morning, and they were saying they lowered the barriers to entry into qualifications, and a lot of people said, "Oh, you're going to be dumbing down here." And they said, actually, what happened was that we looked at it, and the people who are now partners in the firm wouldn't have been able to get in with the qualifications necessary that they were having. they took them down, and actually the performance of people, according to their metrics, was better among the people who wouldn't have been able to get in previously. Yeah, so relying on sort of qualifications as a proxy for potential wasn't working for them.
Yeah, that's a brilliant example. We've had Tom Lias and Grace Osborne on similar sessions to these ones, and tried to kind of use their example to provoke others into thinking differently and taking that kind of action. So thanks for bringing that up. I guess, it's often said you can't be what you can't see. I know from our initial conversations, that resonates with you. I think that's obviously a Gandhi quote, but like, how do you think we can put financial services onto more young people's career radar, and to get them, to get them thinking? I guess that two-way connection of us meeting them and them being able to meet us.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's because it's a fireside chat, I've got an anecdote, and I think that
Nice. That's
you and I
good. That's
mentioned
good.
this, talked about this before, and it's one of the things that I put in my book because it really stuck with me, about how one of the teachers at my school when I was a teenager, I don't know what prompted them to do this, but they arranged for a presentation about working in financial services. They had someone from Midland Bank, which is now, you can see how long ago this was, that it's now part of HSBC. And previous to then, I think people in my school had thought of banking as stamping checkbook stubs in the branch and hadn't really seen anything apart from that. And it gave an insight into a whole new world, which was really valuable. But it really didn't feel like it was relevant. It felt like they were giving a presentation about an uncontacted tribe or other, like you see documentaries on the television, and you see those documentaries and you think, oh, that's interesting. You don't think I could be one of that tribe. Something else happens there. And one of the things I'm really aware of, and you mentioned Sam Friedman, people generally follow the career path that they've had a chance to become familiar with. And for a lot of reasons, it's a really good idea to follow that path because it's not a risky leap in the dark. So one of the things Sam Friedman in his work brings out is that if one of your parents were a doctor, you're 24 times more likely than the rest of us to become a doctor. And that's because they've had a steady drip of familiarization, and it seems like something they know about. If that sort of behavior was exhibited by working class people, sort of, if I'd have followed my dad down the mine, that would have been called a herd mentality. That's called normal in middle class circles. But it is one of those things that is really necessary to try and familiarize people with what jobs are available, which, if you have people who work in it already in your social circle, you know about this. If you don't, then it's too much of a risk to go into it. You really need to familiarize with it. And I think that financial services really increase their talent pipeline when they do basically getting to know you initiatives with communities that don't generally know you.
Yeah, and it sounds so simple, doesn't it? But it's hugely important. And you're right. It's not just the sort of not this nepotism, but that awareness of parental occupation flowing down. But there's also just there's more of a general awareness of doctor, lawyer, dentist. These are more sort of tangible professions in society that people will be more familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And financial services kind of has a bit more of an opaqueness to it that people aren't necessarily as kind of familiar with, and maybe a bit daunted by even attempting. So I fully agree with you in terms of the need to find a way of getting more exposure and almost improving the financial services brand for early careers. The next question I wanted to ask was about getting in and getting on. We talk a lot. I mean, there's an organisation that's effectively formed, Progress Together, which is an incredible organisation, for anyone who's not aware of it. And that's effectively formed because of this realization that there's a big difference between getting into a profession and then getting on, and the progression point is something that's been spoken about a lot more over the last few years in terms of how do we crack that. Once you get into an organization, there's different stats that are flying around out there from the Bridge Group, and Jenny will be able to correct me here, but often things like 2.6, sort of 2.5 times longer to get to the same level when you account for background qualifications and so on. So what do you think we need to do in this area to help people progress when they get within an organization? What's your sense of that?
I think a lot of the time it's about having clear ways in which you do progress in the organization. One of the other people who's now in tech, again, who I interviewed, said that he thought when he started work, he said he thought that the way you progress is similar to the way in which you become a fairy tale princess. In that you're good and virtuous and you keep your head down and your work will speak for itself. And he said it took a long time to realize that isn't the way. Whereas if you say to people from the get-go, and there are companies that are good at this, at saying, okay, you're starting here, this is where career paths might take you in here, and this is actually what you need to do in order to do those things. So you have pretty much, you enter the store and you have a store guide and someone points you to where the escalators are, metaphorically. That is really useful to be able to tell people, where you could go, how to get there. There is also something there about when people come in, talking about how things are done around here. So you don't have to figure things out, but not so much that you're prescribing things out of people, not so much that you're forcing people to become something different and to self-censor any heterodox opinions, I guess, because those are useful insights. A lot of this is about capital. It's social capital, who you know. Can you go to someone who can tell you something like this as well? So a lot of the initiatives are about having mentoring by more senior experienced staff tend to work as well, so that they can say, oh yeah, this is how you do it. So there's all those things basically so people know what they're doing, but you can't get away from as well that there's something about how other people will see you. And some of the reasons why people from not the right background, if you like, might progress more slowly is they're not seen as the right sort. And you might not have the right accent, you might not have the right way of presenting yourself. Sometimes your results are fine, but you don't fit the mold. And quite often there is a big penalty for coming from not the right background. If you combine that with being female as well, it's even bigger.
Yeah. I mean, look, we could probably have a whole session on that specific topic itself, but I'm glad that you mentioned the female part, and obviously intersectionality is a big part of the E&I movement, but in particular with social mobility, I know there's a double disadvantage, and thank you for flagging that. I think we've got roughly sort of time for one more question. I sort of nudged at this earlier on, but how would you describe the current state of social mobility in the UK, and is the government doing enough? And I guess the next follow-on question would be what would you advise them do?
I think, well, I'm never going to go, no, it's fine, it's great. I think they've been talking about it a lot. But one of the things to say there is, no amount of initiatives focused on education and equalising opportunities are going to increase the number of opportunities that are available. And so there has to be something, and whenever there's been lots of upward social mobility in this country, it's been when new opportunities are opening up. And actually, from the other side of that, financial services are something that can provide fuel for that in terms of what opportunities are out there. So there are some initiatives going on, but it's not nearly joined up enough. Quite often you get something in schools. I got something in school that was work experience, and then I finished the work experience and there was no one to say to me, well, you've had a taster, this is how you take it up. So I didn't go down that path. You need to recognize that where people go in life is a journey. And you can't just do something about, oh, well, we'll open up the doors to people because, there's things happening upstream. But I think it needs doing a lot because, we see a lot of sort of anti-establishmentism going on at the moment. And that's really strongly correlated with people who feel like their chances in life are being constrained, or their chances in life, or they're going down from where they previously were, where their parents were. And I think going back to another referendum, the Scottish independence referendum, just before that I was in Glasgow, and people were talking to me about that, and I said to someone, "Oh, how are you voting?" They would go, "Oh, well, I was going to vote, stay with the UK, but since the banks have been saying stay with the UK, I'm thinking about voting the other way." And that sort of idea about someone feeling that their opportunities are being constrained and that other worlds operate separately to them is something that is really important and really worrying.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. And I mean, systems change is daunting, and effectively that's kind of what we're dealing with really with social mobility, is shifting the system. And I think you sometimes have to think into two or three different horizons or dimensions. But one is the immediate one, which is how can we get more people into lucrative, well-paid jobs like in financial services. And then the other horizon is potentially the more daunting one, which is how do we change the system so that there is more general equality across the UK, both geographically and across different professions. And that is the second one that is probably harder, because we're trying to shift the dial. But I don't know if you have any parting thoughts around that, and that otherwise we'll bring to a close and hand over to the panel. But I'll give you a moment just to say a final word.
Across the country, I worked with a client recently, and something like 85% of their staff they were based in London. 85% of their staff came from London and the home counties. And that can be a massive thing, and it does mean you're not seeing the whole country where your business operates. That is a huge thing to do. There's levers that need pulling there, but it's also down to just individuals as well, that quite often people feel uncomfortable, but in order for people from ordinary backgrounds to not be in their discomfort zone all the time, some people have got to be in their discomfort zone some of the time. But it's fine, you don't grow in your comfort zone. So, it does us all good to think about, okay, is this place adjusted for the likes of me?
Wow, that's a really good place to end this conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure, Duncan. Thank you again for your time, and we'll hand over to David and the esteemed panel that we've got waiting in the green room.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, James and Duncan. That was absolutely fascinating. One of the lines I wrote down was this, I think it was the David Lammy example of the crash course in applied anthropology, It reminds me of speaking to Andy Haldane. He was talking about his upbringing in the northeast of England and South Yorkshire, and joining the Bank of England as a graduate, and having to learn bankalese, which was largely based around Latin, which he'd never studied. So yeah, very, very important to think about how welcoming an environment might be for people from different backgrounds. I'd like to welcome on camera, hopefully, the three amazing panelists we have with us. So I can see Jenny is here, Darren, and of course Niamh. So Jenny, just as a brief introduction, is the relatively newly installed CEO of the Bridge Group, which many of us in social mobility and socio-economic diversity circles will have heard of before. Darren Johnson is the Chief Operating Officer of Impact Asset Management and a board member of the Diversity Project. And Niamh Fenton is a portfolio construction and research analyst at Fidelity, but more importantly for today, the co-chair of their global social mobility network, and certainly some things we can learn from her experience in doing that. And you'll find out a lot more about them as they answer some of the questions I'll pose to them, and I'll leave that to them to let you know some of their learnings over time. But one thing I wanted to start off with, if you guys don't mind, is a relatively controversial question, but I think it's, given that they're, and we could be forgiven maybe for thinking that there's, in some quarters at least, a bit of a backlash against diversity initiatives. Why should we bother with things like economic diversity, social mobility, particularly in our industry, which is asset management, but let's think about financial services more broadly. Generally considered quite a successful industry, a big part of the UK economy. By focusing on it, should we bother? And if we do, are we basically lowering the quality of our people? And it is a people-based industry. I'll start off with Darren, but I suspect you'll all have something to say on that point.
I'm happy to go first. So thank you for having me. So I think, yeah, we should be absolutely bothered because I guess ignoring socioeconomic diversity doesn't preserve quality. It restricts it, in my opinion. I think it kind of limits the range of insight, perspective, and, of course, problem-solving ability that we need in our industry. I also think there's a misconception, especially in successful industries like ours, that I guess inclusion somehow lowers the bar, right? I've heard that many times. But in fact, to me, it's the opposite. As mentioned before, the Diversity Project published some research showing that cognitive diversity, diversity of thought, life experience, and background gives investment teams a measurable edge. But only when you create environments where people feel safe enough to contribute fully. I guess in asset management, we do pride ourselves on position of insight. So why wouldn't we want voices in the room that see risk differently? Voices that can spot opportunities or that others miss, of course, or challenge consensus. And let's be honest, it's not just a pipeline issue, it's a perception issue. That's what we're going through here of people from those types of backgrounds. As we all know and have heard before, talent is everywhere, but opportunity isn't. So if we're serious about long-term performance, I guess trust, relevance, then yes, we absolutely should bother. Not just because it's right, but because it's smart business. That's my view.
Really interesting. Niamh, anything to add?
Yeah, I completely echo Darren's points from the investment case. I think the other case that's super key is from our client's perspective. So we see at RFP stage, so that's request for proposal, we get questions from clients asking us about the data that we collect around the diversity of our workforce. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our clients. If they're placing an emphasis on this, we really should too. We also see growing conversations around this with our regulators as well. So the FCA in the UK continues to grow and increase their expectations in terms of what we publish with respect to our diversity data. And hopefully we're going to get to a point where we have higher expectations for publishing socioeconomic data as well.
I can just hear heads of distribution at asset managers pounding down the door of the C-suite, making sure that they're not being excluded from RFPs and pitch opportunities. So actually, incentives can be quite powerful. Jenny, just to you next.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so we know in the UK that we've got one of the worst rates of social mobility in the developed world. And I think it was Demos and Co-op actually quantified the opportunity for greater social mobility within workplaces that would actually boost our annual UK GDP by about 19 billion, and actually could raise an extra 6.8 billion in annual tax revenues, which feels very relevant given the Chancellor's just unveiled the spending plans. So on a macro level, it matters. And if you think about the financial services sector, sort of the raising of capital, the investing of capital, it being a high growth sector, you would absolutely, to Darren's point, be wanting to make sure you've got the best talent, which comes from all walks of life, you know, in that industry and in that sector. But on a personal level, as I think Duncan talked about, this is very much at the heart of, you know, livelihoods, you know, the financial security for families, having kind of rewarding work. So it's absolutely on an individual as well as a macroeconomical level important. So I think there's been a bit of a lack of focus on socioeconomic diversity in some of the narrative that's potentially come out, and there's a real opportunity for us to focus on that here, certainly in the UK, but also around intersectionality. So absolutely something we should be focused on.
Brilliant. And you said, as you said, it's something we should focus on. And Social Mobility Day is tomorrow, and hopefully people are excited at least, or minded to do something about it in their own firms tomorrow. What would the single most important thing you think a firm could do to progress either social mobility or move the dial a bit on socioeconomic diversity?
I'm happy to take that first. I think it's quite a hard question.
It is tough, yeah, in fairness.
I don't think that there's any sort of silver bullet, you know, in terms of kind of any one response for an organisation. I will come on to data because naturally I think from both my experience at KPMG, where I was prior to the Bridge Group, but also the Bridge Group, that is very much at the heart of where we work with organisations. But I think to Duncan's point earlier, the culture is so important, the unspoken rules. So I think, you know, impressing upon anyone to think about better understanding their culture, trying to sort of break down where those kind of unspoken rules exist, you know, really helping ensure that everyone can kind of thrive within the organisation is absolutely at the core of what this is about. But I think to do that successfully, data is very much at the heart of it, whether it's kind of quantitative data or qualitative data. So, you know, thinking about where is your starting point as an organisation, what does the workforce look like, better understanding where there might be discrepancies, whether that's at a senior level or even within the organisation is key, and Progress Together, which James mentioned earlier, works with us at the Bridge Group on sort of really better understanding across their member organisations the makeup of the financial services sector. But then I think on overlaying that with kind of what's the experience, the insight, what do people think, how do they, you know, find, you know, the organisation is so key to sort of test those insights. So yeah, data, frankly, from my perspective, is absolutely key. And only from there can you really start to look at how you're improving from a social mobility perspective.
So it's a case that data is not going to move the dial all by itself, but if we don't have it, we can't really analyse or measure the problem and monitor how we're doing against it.
Yeah, you
Darren,
can't track, you can't evaluate. Yeah. Exactly.
Darren, do you agree with that, or have you got a different perspective?
No, I don't want to keep saying we agree because we're trying to show that, you know.
Yeah, bit of conflict.
Yeah, but no, I do. I think all very important stuff. But what I would say, I'll give you an abstract answer and I'll give you some specifics. So I think we as an industry, maybe some organizations need to kind of redefine merit so it affects, so it reflects ability, not background or polish. I think in terms of specifics, one of the things that we did at Impacts was we removed the requirement for degrees in a number of our roles, and that single change unlocked an entirely new pool of talent. That single change. We've also tried to challenge some of our assumptions about what good looks like. And as soon as you start doing that, everything starts to shift. So maybe another example would be, you know, typically when people leave, you get the old job description, you update a few words, and then you put it back out there, right? And and when you actually look at that job description, you really think about where you are today, because chances are things have changed. If your organization is not changing, I would imagine that's a problem for you. So it's unlikely that your job description is still the same. And if you really look at what you actually need and what you actually want, you start realizing that actually some of the things you put there is like automatic, such as having a degree or whatever, and you're not really focusing on what are the competencies or the skills actually needed to do that role appropriately and properly. So I think as organizations, they should start with just looking at, what does good look like, reassess what you're after, and consider things like, do you really need a degree for some of the roles that exist within your organization?
One thing I want to pick up, or two things I want to pick up on there, if you don't mind, one for you and one actually for Niamh after. But in terms of what might just seem like a standard job description that we, as you said, rinse and repeat every time the role goes on, do you think that's a large firm issue, a small firm issue, or across the board? I'm wondering if smaller firms may be better minded to be a bit more bespoke about exactly what they need, and maybe some of the larger firms, they're so used to hiring a number of a particular role that they have this almost generic description of what they're looking for. And, they get so many applicants, they might as well ask for a degree, because why not? They're going to get enough applicants in their minds anyway, and so on.
Is that a question to me?
Yeah, it is. Sorry, yeah, I was picking that up. Yeah.
So I think it depends. It's hard to generalize because a lot depends on HR teams and hiring managers, right? Some people are just lazy thinkers, so it's less risky to take that job description that existed before and go to market with the same one. That's it. It's less risky in their mind. They change it and do something different, and they hire someone that doesn't quite work. It's a problem. So I think it depends on mindset, and it depends on what you think is a risk and what isn't. I think it's a risk if you don't review your job description. It's a risk if you don't get up to date with what you actually need for now and in the future of whatever role that is. I think it's a risk. So I think it depends on the HR team, how they're set up. I think it depends on who is making the hiring decision, who is writing that job description, and that could vary throughout organizations.
Niamh, do you have a perspective? I know, obviously, with the sort of earlier careers element and what good looks like, are we judging people in the right way? I mean, thinking back to Duncan's example of Brown Jacobson, they obviously reduced the requirements to become a trainee or a graduate trainee, and of course, many of the partners wouldn't have passed the previous test. Obviously, Darren's given and Jenny's given an example as well. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question, and it's something which slightly jumps back to a question with what I would recommend people to do. Even if you're not in an HR team, you can have a voice with respect to reviewing and pushing for better hiring practices. One of the great feedback points that we got from the Social Mobility Foundation, we do that Social Mobility Employers Index annually, is to review our hiring process. So myself and some others in our social mobility network have a bi-monthly catch up with the HR team to review their processes. So what we provide is an independent viewpoint on the process that they have. They are, of course, experts in hiring, but we can provide a different lens. For example, it might be accessibility guides that we provide people before they come into the company. So an example is I will sometimes have people reach out to me on LinkedIn asking what to wear, what to expect, how many people they'll be interviewed by. So why don't we just give that to everyone up front? So providing a guide like that, perhaps it's assisting people when they come to interview with costs for transport. All of these areas which can seem quite obvious if you're from a lower socioeconomic background yourself, and is something that puts you off applying for a city job. But it's something that we could very easily do as an organisation to improve. And so that would just be my reflection there. And if you don't mind, my reflection on Jenny and Darren's points in terms of what to do as an organisation. I agree with both of you. But what I think it can sometimes feel difficult for, if you're part of an organisation, you're not in the HR, you're not in a senior leadership role, is answering that question with what you can do. So again, I would just really echo that everyone should have a voice in the organisation. I hope everyone on the line feels like they do. But the thing that I've seen as being one of the best drivers that we've done within our network is create open spaces where people can discuss and debate these ideas. Because often, say something like cost for transport, I know that one does seem quite obvious. However, if that's not raised, then it won't be improved. So if you create an open environment where people can say, actually, I struggled with this when I got into the industry, or actually, I didn't know what to wear day one, then we can start to build a more inclusive industry from that perspective.
And obviously you were involved in setting up the social mobility network. Is that where some of these conversations are had? Or is that a good way of having sort of almost power in numbers to have some of those conversations and sort of feed them up the chain, so to speak?
Yeah, exactly. So just to give a bit of context, we started off as a UK network. It was just a group of very passionate people who either were allies or had been from a low socioeconomic background themselves. We started off actually using advice, I believe, from the Social Mobility Foundation to do stories. So we shared those and it snowballed from there. So we now have a network in each of our different global regions. And it's so interesting because you'll get perspectives from people based in Hong Kong that'll be totally different to what we have here in London. And so you can bounce ideas off each other and test out different solutions.
Yeah, it is interesting actually. When you are a global firm, you find out that maybe we've got a regional problem in the UK, but actually in another European country, it's more about what school you went to versus which one you didn't, and yeah, it's such a complex issue. In the spirit of learning from people's experiences, Jenny, obviously your prior role wasn't in financial services, so to speak, more professional services and consulting. And I hope I'm not insulting us all in our industry by saying that it looks to me at least that the consulting firms may be a bit ahead of us on this particular topic. What can you take from your experiences there and kind of help us maybe steal a march by learning how to get ahead a bit quicker than we otherwise might?
Yeah, I mean, I'd also include the legal sector actually. So both the legal and the accountancy sector, they were sort of, I suppose, compelled to take action on social mobility a lot earlier. There was a pretty damning report in 2009 from the then government, which heavily criticised both sectors actually for their lack of social mobility. And what came out of that was Prime, a sort of cross-sector initiative in the legal sector around work experience. And then in the accountancy sector, we initiated Access Accountancy, which is again a cross-sector initiative, very much focused also on work experience and access into the industry, but also with data at the heart of it. And of course now, yeah, financial services has Progress Together, which is doing brilliant work at bringing the sector together. And you're starting to see other kind of consortia in other sectors like real estate and others. So there is, I think, quite a bit to be learned from other sectors. I would say there is a similar trend probably coming through on some of the data, certainly that we see across all the different sectors from the Bridge Group. So James was correct in the statistic he shared earlier on financial services that you are ultimately sort of 2.5 times less likely to reach senior roles despite equal performance. That's in financial services. And in the legal sector, in fact, a bit like the Brown-Jacobson point, we found this sort of performance paradox in that some leading legal firms found employees from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were 75% more likely to rank in the top 10% of performers. So why does all of this matter? I mean, ultimately, it's showing that there isn't any difference in performance, but there is definitely a progression gap experience across multiple different sectors. And the work that we've done with KPMG at the Bridge Group has also shown that that is sort of compounded from an intersectionality point of view. In terms of what you can though do, I think what good really looks like, and I'd say a number of the accountancy firms have been doing this, is really trying to take a much more holistic strategy and kind of look at sort of end to end for social mobility. So everything from your attraction and your selection all the way through to kind of culture, development, inclusion, progression, just really a bit like the Social Mobility Employer Index that Niamh mentioned earlier, like really looking end to end in the way that they encourage you to do so. And I think there's been some really good kind of best practice coming out there. And we might talk about alternative pathways as a really good example, I think, from accountancy and the legal sector we can come on to later. But I think that sort of connecting of the dots, not just in the outreach, but much more moving into what does retention, good retention look like? What are the development programs that might need to be developed? As well as then that focus on progression is certainly something that a number of other sectors have really begun to do. But ultimately at the heart of where I think there's been success is collaboration. So it's very much around, there are, a number of charities that definitely collaborate more in this space. There are a number of organisations that are all facing similar challenges, that actually by collaborating we are stronger in addressing some of these challenges. So the best practice sharing, etc. And Progress Together is doing that brilliantly within financial services. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned from some of the other sectors where they've really taken a sort of data-led approach, but really made sure they've joined up that whole continuum from the start to sort of the end of your career to target the interventions.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's obviously a lot more complex than I was thinking about. The story or the example of the orchestra that, you know, to fix their problem of basically having essentially male orchestras was to have blind auditions, right? And then, oh great, let's just pick the best musicians. It's very hard to do that, I guess, or it was certainly more complex to do that in our industry. And some of those other sectors thankfully started a bit earlier and maybe had a bit more of a tailwind behind them, certainly in terms of sentiments. And we might maybe in a slightly tougher environment in terms of getting attention and resourcing, whether that's financial resourcing at our firms or maybe the people, the time commitment to spend on it. Darren, you're a COO. You've got to juggle a lot of different demanding priorities, and I suspect you have chats with CEOs, CIOs, and all sorts of other people to horse trade resources and so on. Any advice on how we can ensure that we are getting some resources here to do some of the things that Jenny was saying, and how much of that you think is about cost and how much you think is just about internal commitment to spend the time doing it?
Yeah, there's a quote I like to say actually with this when I talk to people. I said, look, like if we're serious about this and we understand the value social mobility can bring in terms of new talent, don't bolt it on, build it in. And a lot of organizations try to bolt it on, but really you should build it into your whole processes. So that's what I spend time trying to convince people why that's necessary. I don't think you need a bigger budget. You just need to have design with intentionality. So basically be intentional about what you're trying to do. I guess you need to try and embed social mobility into hiring and promotions. And internal mobility in your organization, and some of the conversations I have, it's like, how do we do that? How do we make it happen? One area, we talk about sometimes with some of our suppliers is, with our supplier selection, we start asking questions about, how they hire as well, etc. So, there's been many debates as to whether that's a valuable thing or not in doing it. But I think it's valuable because it shows them our values when we talk to some suppliers about that. And I think, the conversations I tend to have is like trying to remind people that not everyone starts in the same place. And I think, people just take that for granted, right? But, you have to recognize not everyone starts in the same place. So really you need to design a system that, I guess means, the starting line doesn't define the finish line. That makes sense. And so I spent a lot of time trying to explain that to people, because as I say, it's not because of any malice or anything else. It's just that when you're in business, you're just in business, you're just working, and you don't understand perhaps how you got to where you got to versus how someone else got to where they got to, and what differences exist, and how that's powerful. This isn't, whether you're privileged or not privileged, everyone has something to bring to the table, and it's really just trying to get that mix together and that inclusion and that proper leadership to make sure we get the best out of everyone. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's
no, you did. I think it's very clear. It's not about going cap in hand asking for money, because that alone is not going to solve it. It's actually more about building it into the fabric of what you're doing day to day, and make sure that all the hiring managers, everybody is doing this sort of stuff in an intentional way. I think, no, you certainly answered the question. You mentioned, and both, in fact, all three of you at some point have mentioned the idea of hiring and how we get people in. And one of the things we've had increasing interest in, and we've seen a few firms already start to do it, is get more people into the industry in an alternative or a non-traditional way. How can firms do more to get people into the industry in a less traditional way? And I'm thinking through the lens of, I remember going to university, I got means tested, and even if I'd not been means tested, the most I'd have to pay at that stage for fees, I think, was £1,000. That's obviously, I'm fairly old these days, so that's why that is. And you could get a student loan at relatively low rates and so on. And I think, from my personal perspective, if I was making that choice today, it would be a much, much harder choice to do that. What can we do to get people who may not either want to, be able to afford to, or go to university? What could we do? And I think, Jenny, you mentioned some things that the legal and accountancy firms have done. And Niamh, I think you've got some views on this as well. So we'll go to Jenny first.
Yeah, happy to. So I mean, I think having a sort of closer look and building out alternative pathways and not this sort of traditional going into higher education route is really important. Certainly in the accountancy sector, there was sort of a kind of coordinated approach to have more apprenticeship routes into the organisations, all the way up to level 7, so to that kind of professional qualification level. And at KPMG, it certainly predated the apprenticeship levy, where we launched our apprenticeship programme. And I think what was so important in the design of that apprenticeship was that there was effectively parity with the sort of graduate peers, in that it wouldn't just be that you could only get to a certain level within the organisation. And it's now that we're starting to see the fruits of that programme, because ultimately people are progressing now beyond that sort of assistant manager into manager and beyond level. And in fact, actually, you could do it faster by doing an apprenticeship programme than going to university, coming in on a graduate scheme. And the talent that was coming through those programmes, phenomenal. And I think I saw Joanna Hughes on the call. Certainly at Bridge Group, we did some really interesting work with City Century, who've been looking at solicitor apprentices. So the legal sector slightly later to this, but they've been certainly embracing it in more recent years. And they found that, yeah, they've absolutely had kind of in the cohort that City Century have been focused on a more socioeconomically and ethnically diverse cohort of it, than the sort of broader solicitor population. The apprentices are thriving, they're happy, and actually in terms of their route into the sector earlier, it's a really positive way of broadening that socioeconomic diversity, but also giving alternative ways and just following that traditional university route. But I do think the key is making sure that parity is designed from the outset. Otherwise, you're going to then have another problem later down the line where people won't be able to progress. So that's a really important consideration for the apprenticeship route.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of the sort of tertiary education in Germany, where whether you go technical or you go academic, they're considered as important as each other. Niamh, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so from a ERG perspective, which is Employee Resource Group, we have a couple of different ways that we like to engage with people potentially coming into the industry. So we do have apprenticeship programs as well, which have been incredible to have just diversity of thought coming in from such a young age. One thing I will just kind of add to Jenny's points there, that you do have to ultimately remember as an organisation, apprentices and apprenticeships are different to graduate schemes, and they need to be treated as such and make sure that they have the appropriate resourcing behind them. That would just be the one thing that I would note, but I would really encourage bringing that to your HR team if you don't already have it in place. The things that we try and do from an outreach perspective include actually one thing that Duncan touched on, which is going into schools. So introducing and normalizing financial services to people from a young age. We don't just see that as we want to hire people from these schools, but we also see it as important in terms of financial education and awareness, and potentially in the future, they could be our clients as well. So that's a really nice opportunity to get in at that stage. Looking a bit later on, there are really amazing organizations that you can partner with. We've got things like Upreach, where you can assist with mentoring. You've got the 93% Club as well. So there's lots of different charities doing amazing work. Thinking a bit later, so people who are, say, over the age of 25, it's working with different local organisations as well. So making sure you're there if you want to do a career path change. One thing which, is a really interesting conversation, we don't have it yet internally, is adult apprenticeships. So how you can support people when they make the change, and maybe when they didn't have the opportunity at the age of 18, where ultimately you're making your decisions when you're actually 16, a bit scary, when you're a bit older and you want to make that change. So I think as an industry, we do need to do a little bit more to make sure we capture that area of potentially really amazing colleagues.
That's really interesting. I went to a talk from somebody who works in the civil service, and they said the majority of their apprentices are over the age of 30. So it's in some industries, I think that is actually the norm, strangely. It surprised me at the time. Darren, do you have anything to add on these alternative pathways before we get to our final question?
Just quickly to say, Investment 2020 is in our industry and a great partner to partner with if you want to have other ways of attracting talent into your organization. But also to say that just don't focus just on attraction. I think as Duncan maybe mentioned, it's more about familiarization. So people, if they're familiar with the industry, they're more likely to go and get a job in the industry. So drip feed visibility. Don't just do one-off career days. Yes, absolutely, talk in schools. Really, really important to do that. So yeah, that's all I can reinforce and add.
That's great. No, very wise words indeed. Right, we're very near time, but I do want to ask you this final question, and in as few words as possible, but I won't give you a limit. What is the one action that you'd recommend the folks watching today should take or do tomorrow in their organizations, given that it's Social Mobility Day? And we obviously heard Niamh speaking earlier, but we'll start with Darren.
Gosh, I think I'll do an abstract. Change one door, review one process, challenge one assumption. Do that.
Fantastic. Jenny?
Oh, how do I follow that? Okay.
So it was a hospital pass.
I will keep going on the data. I would just, encourage you to talk to your HR, your DEI team, to just say how much do we really know about the experiences of our colleagues from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and that will tell you if you even know who, how many people you have from a lower socioeconomic background. But just the experience is really important to understand.
Fantastic. And lastly, Niamh?
I would start off with the conversation. So reach out to people, understand them better, and start the conversation.
Fantastic. That's what a way to end. And we could have listened to you talk all day. You've obviously got some incredible insights. And I'm sure if anybody does have questions, please feel free to add us all on LinkedIn. I'm very happy for you to send me questions. I'm sure the panelists are too. I'd like to thank all of today's participants. As I said, they've been fantastic. Duncan and James at the beginning. And of course, Jenny, Niamh, and Darren. A few things to flag before we go. Well, firstly, I would say the Social Mobility Employers Index from the Social Mobility Foundation is totally free to enter, and they'll help you do a review with your firm of where you could be improving. It's such a useful toolkit. On the 1st of July, we have the webinar that people have been talking about on the cognitive diversity in asset management with Professor Alex Edmonds. For those of you who don't know Alex Edmonds, he is the ultimate pragmatist. He's very critical of claims around ESG, some academic papers on diversity and responsible investing. And what I'm really pleased about is this is a pragmatist research project that gives practical and holistic view of what we can do and what the benefits are. Of course, don't forget the social mobility toolkit that the social mobility community have put together. Lots of good case studies in there, tips that you can bring into your own firms. And lastly, I would mention that the final event in the Leveling the Playing Field speaker series is going to be around apprenticeships, and the Diversity Project's been doing lots of work on how we can collectively take advantage of things like the apprenticeship levy, and how we can maybe collectively as member firms join together to put in place a really good apprenticeship program. Of course, keep an eye out for the Bridge Group and search for The End of Aspiration from Duncan Exley. I can assure you it's on Amazon and available in all good bookshops. Thank you so much for your time, and see you on the next one.